Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. Today we're going to deep dive into narcissism again. Today particularly with the focus on covert narcissism, and I'm joined by Kieran Fitzpatrick over there in Dublin, who is one of the UK's experts on narcissism. And it's such a deep area, we're going to be splitting the different forms of narcissism up over the weeks. If you haven't seen our first episode where we kind of have an overview of narcissism, I'll include a link below. And as I say, today we're going to take a deep dive into covert narcissism. Kieran, before we start, can we just have a quick recap for anybody who's not, most people will know the phrase. And as I said in the last podcast, it's quite overused. But can you just recap the different forms of narcissism?
Yeah. I mean, in our first podcast, we had a kind of general conversation about it and around it. And because it's such a huge area, as you've said, we didn't go too deeply into any particular even aspect of it. But one of the things we touched on is that there's various different types of narcissists now. They've been defined at least 8, if not more, different types of narcissist. And as research continues, they're dividing them out even a little bit more, and they're being a bit more specific about the different specific types of narcissism. And what people generally think of when they hear the word narcissist, or the common perception of them, are what are known as grandiose, malignant, or communal narcissists. So grandiose is a word that covers all of them. They have this overt, big personality, flash, and seemingly overconfident, unshakable confidence. The malignant takes that a step further, where they project a powerful image, maybe too powerful. Malignant there's a thin line between what's a malignant narcissist and what's a psychopath, because they share an awful lot of traits, and maybe that would be a podcast someday to try and tease them apart. There's probably one major difference between them that would be the key to differentiating them. And then communal narcissists are these ones that people are becoming aware of, where they're very publicly involved in something like big charities or big philanthropy enterprises, or are seen to be very do-gooders, basically. But behind the scenes, then, as stories emerge, as they pass on, or as their charities or their enterprises collapse, and people come out and start talking about the leaders, the founders, they're not what they seem, But one that possibly more people encounter and don't realize it is the covert narcissist that we're going to talk about today. Now, probably what we could do is go over the traits that will characterize all narcissists, and then look at what's the difference with the covert narcissist. How are they defined as different, and how do they sometimes not even appear to be narcissists? Sometimes I think of them like camouflage narcissists. Behind the camouflage, they're dyed-in-the-wool, proper 100% narcissists, but a lot of their traits and characteristics and a lot of their behaviors and actions are kind of camouflaged. And even in ways that people don't actually initially realize they're narcissists, or they might even initially realize that they're not, personality-wise and their mental health-wise, they're not super healthy, but probably not narcissists. They're sometimes misunderstood as being depressives or anxious people, because another name they use for these is vulnerable narcissists. So they can come across as quite vulnerable, rather than the grandiose, which comes across as kind of bulletproof.
Is the vulnerability linked to the victimhood that they project? Or because I wouldn't, I know the phrase vulnerable, but you wouldn't necessarily attribute being vulnerable to a covert narcissist.
No. So this is where we go back to things common to all narcissists. The root of all narcissism is a sense of vulnerability, believe it or not. Is a sense of not so much inferiority, but a sense of having been hard done by, not dealt a good hand, that they've been unlucky, or life has been hard on them, and they need to protect themselves from this feeling, which I suppose is a feeling of vulnerability and insecurity. And to combat that, they create this personality that's like a suit of armor, And I suppose that's why it's a personality disorder. They create a complete 3D personality and begin to live that personality. Now, the thing about covert narcissists is their vulnerability is often more visible. Now, probably not visible publicly, but visible to people close to them, maybe family, close friends, unfortunately, their children, and if they have a partner. Now, all of these people, the terminology I think we touched on in the last podcast, in using the vocabulary of narcissism, are referred to as hosts. And it's purposely that word because it's the same as a parasite has a host. You know, narcissists feed off the people around them. In fact, the only purpose a narcissist has for having somebody or tolerating somebody around them is what can they get from them? What can they feed off them? And so, you know, this narcissistic feed is feeding that ego, feeding their personality. So feeding that confidence, feeding that ego, feeding the beliefs that they have that they're bigger and better and, you know, stronger, better at everything. You know, we'll go through a few of the typical characteristics to get the idea. But they need somebody to feed this. It's a bit like a hologram. You need to keep the projectors going. You know, if you turn off the projectors, the hologram is gone. So similarly with narcissists, if they don't get that outside energy feeding this false personality they've created for themselves, that personality might disappear and they'd be left with their true selves. So this is the irony, really, is that at the root of narcissism, the reason for creating this personality is that they themselves couldn't live with what they perceive to be the reality. And the reality being is that they're inferior, that they're less than, that they're insufficient, and they literally can't live with that. So they create this. So it's not a split personality. They create this image of themselves, but which becomes their personality, so much so that they don't realize that they've created this, which, as we touched on the last podcast, is why we very rarely as therapists see narcissists come to us for help, because they won't be aware that they've got a problem. And part of the reason they won't be aware, and why possibly they'll never be aware, is to be aware that their problem is they've created an artificial personality or delusion we talked about earlier. If they were to realize that this is just a delusion, then they'd be made suddenly starkly aware of the reality, which is something they can't bear to live with. So going back, we've gone off on tangents there, but the vulnerability is with the covert narcissist. So for people watching this, and you know, a trait or a characteristic they may have seen in somebody who appears to be confident, who appears to have very strong opinions, who appears to be always right about things, who appears to feel quite superior, is that behind the scenes in moments, this very bitter, sad almost side to them comes out. But then, you know, it's an anomaly. If you start to react to the sad side of them or the vulnerable side, they'll turn on you, because now you're reflecting back the vulnerability that they've revealed, and they don't want to reveal to themselves, so they'll switch back again. So people say it's a situation where you can never, if you're with one for a lifetime, it'll be a lifetime of never being able to get it right. You know, if you don't respond to their vulnerability, well, then you don't care, you're cruel, you're heartless, you're selfish. Again, these are all projections. You're all the things that they are. And if you do respond to them in some sort of sympathetic way, then in their mind, you're being condescending, or you're not respecting who they think they really are, you know?
As I said on the last podcast, a narcissist accusation is a confession.
Oh, yeah.
So going back over those points, would it be fair to say that the flying monkeys that we spoke about in the first episode is aligned with the I don't know what the thumbs come up, is aligned with the hosts? Would that be similar or identical? Would it be the same thing?
Well, this is where we'll go back. You know, if we look at a covert narcissist will have all the attributes, if you like, all the characteristics of any other narcissist, but will execute that, will live that in a more subtle, less obvious, less obtuse way. And but they'll have all of those. And when we can go into it later on, when we look at more specifically how a covert narcissist differs from many of the other types, we'll see the kind of subtle ways to do that. But they'll have their flying monkeys, they'll have their hosts, they'll manipulate, they'll be devious, they'll be controlling, they'll be destructive, they'll be selfish, they'll be kind of two different persons publicly and privately. An awful lot of this will be common to them, but how they go about living that delusion is the difference,
Funny, yeah, as I was preparing for today, and we've spoken before about covert narcissism and our own personal experiences, it dawned on me, would it be fair to say, and there's probably no research on this, that an overt narcissist is far more likely to be male and a covert female? Because I was actually looking online to see if I could find any celebrities. So if people were unsure, I could, this celebrity, obviously we talk about Donald Trump being quite an overt narcissist, and, but then when it comes to covert, I couldn't find or think of any celebrity, because I think for the very reason is people are so, if you're a covert, you're so adept at hiding that. Possibly, I was thinking Ellen DeGeneres, but then that might be, and that's only something that's come out recently, somebody who's kind of loved for years, and then we see another side in the media. Would it be fair to say there are more female covert narcissists? Would you say, Kieran?
It's hard to know. I have no idea, but you reminded me of a joke there of the army parade ground, and at lunchtime the sergeant is marching up and down the lines of soldiers, and he stops at one and he goes, "Private Smith, I didn't see you at camouflage training this morning." He goes, "Thank you, sir." Right. So, this is what I mean. It's very unlikely these will be exposed,
Yes.
and it's often it's families that are become most aware, and because they're so camouflaged and covert, they're unlikely to even become aware of it. That's where, a podcast like this might be helpful to people to put some flesh on the bones of there's something not right at home, or there's something peculiar about my father or my mother, but if we look at the effects these people have on their children, on the people around them, partners and children especially, it's so destructive, but you can't put your finger on it. You can't figure out, again, like, especially if you're brought up as a child, because our default as a child is to defer to our parents and have this assumption that they're perfect and that they know everything and everything they say is right. And that's built into us as a survival instinct, because as children, in the ideal phase especially, our parents have our welfare at heart, and everything they say and everything they do and everything they teach us is to keep us safe and well and protect us and give us a good life. But if we don't know we're dealing with a narcissist, well, those priorities are way down the list.
I know in my own experience, if you ever seen the film Ghost, and it's quite an old film now, isn't it? There's a scene in it, and I think it's where Patrick Swayze is now a ghost, and his ex-wife, partner, girlfriend has met the person that actually killed him or arranged his killing, and he's trying to scream from the afterlife to this person, but obviously he can't be heard because he's in this kind of other. And for me, that's what it feels like. And I sometimes think, having experienced covert narcissism, how can anybody else not see it? But of course, I didn't see it. And if somebody spends their whole life attuning their sociability to be so endearing, so charming, and regale others with just pure charm and charisma, how can anybody be expected to see that that's not authentic?
Yeah.
So on that point, what are the main signs or behaviors that indicate someone might be a covert narcissist, Kieran?
Well, bit like the last podcast. I'm going to rewind to something you said just before your question. Um, you know, and I love this concept of simple psychology. I think I showed you my logo and all. I'm going to try and go down that route of simplifying all this because
Yes.
psychology is quite simple, you know, and everything is kind of if you think of it, it's a simple building. If it's a room, it's just the four walls and a roof. Everything else is decoration. And the simple psychology of a child and childhood, you know, we don't know any better. If you're brought up, as you say, if you're brought up in that environment, you don't know any better. You will actually assume that everyone else's home is the same and everyone else's parents behave the same and that this is what life is about. And then you'll begin to wonder because kids are egocentric.
Yeah.
You're going to wonder what's wrong with me. And add into that the evolutionary instinct to believe and trust your parents implicitly, then there's definitely something wrong with you. If things aren't going well, if your relationship with your parents isn't going well, if you're not being loved and cared for and you're not your parents' absolute priority, and you get a sense of that, which you will because it's an instinctive thing for survival again, that you need to feel loved and cared for and safe. And we've got all sorts of neurons to pick up on when we're not being loved and cared for and we're not a priority. We're going to feel unsafe and we're going to go, what am I doing wrong here? And then we're going to spend the rest of our lives trying to compensate for those failings and faults and whatever it is we've been doing wrong. You know,
What
so
will happen with a child who grows up and say the mum is a covert narcissist, and is the one of the traits as we've spoken about, you've mentioned, is that victimhood. And let's say the child is normal, healthy thinking, has empathy, and the mother who is a victim, how's that going to impact the child?
oh my God, in every conceivable possible way. Um, you know, because again, keeping it simple, that child is going to be missing unconditional love. Because with narcissists, nothing is unconditional. Every relationship is a transaction. Every relationship is what's in it for them. So they're not going to have that with a covert narcissist, for example. If they do any kind of a favor for you or a good deed, or if it's a mother, for example, and they put food on the table for you, you're going to pay for that. You know, you're going to pay for it. And it might be just paying for it and hearing what they've sacrificed to put that food on the table for you. Then you're going to hear, and this is where the difference between the public and private face of a covert narcissist, you're going to hear how tough their life has been, the sacrifices they've had to make, the chances they missed out on, you know, how life dealt them an unfair hand. And you're going to be the focus of all that anger. And so again, as a child, you're going to feel that you've ruined your mother's life or your father's life or whichever, or both of them if you're really unlucky. And so, you know,
That would be incredibly unlucky, wouldn't it?
yeah, and if that's the case, you're screwed, you know, because often in
Yeah.
these cases they talk about if you've one narcissistic parent, the other parent really needs to step up in order to prevent you getting the full brunt of effects of this. But if you've two narcissistic parents, you don't even exist.
That must be incredibly rare, though, I would have thought. I mean, that's almost another podcast that I think I need to research because
Mm,
understanding the nature of narcissism over covert, because you've spoken about looking for a host. The partner that a covert narcissist particularly chooses often are people with a lot of empathy.
yeah,
So actually, the likelihood, and if anybody's watching this and knows of anybody, would love to hear. But actually, I would imagine it's incredibly rare, two narcissists getting together. That'd be a match made in hell, I imagine.
yeah,
But
yeah,
so
yeah. You're
on
probably,
that,
but just
oh,
finish out like you were talking. So imagine growing up with a parent who's never happy. They're always angry at life. And, you know, the very strong black and white views about everything. They're always a victim. You know, they can be cruel and manipulative and aggressive in a passive aggressive kind of way. So this is how you're not able to put your finger on it. They're not proud of you, you know, because you're just a source of supply. And God forbid you become any kind of competition for them. So in actual fact, if you do well, they have to knock down your achievements. They have to negate those achievements. They can't be even seen to have their kids being praised. especially at the expense of them. So if they're in the same room as their child and somebody's doting over the child, they're being ignored. So that's grounds for a narcissist to really kick back, and they become very, very jealous in these ways. And so, any achievements will be either invalidated or just plainly unacknowledged.
Does the specialness that a narcissist feel not wear off onto the child, whereby it's what I've seen sometimes, the child is told that they are brilliant at things off the bat, so to speak. That kind of delusion, or is that rare?
Okay, yeah. Well, you see, so if we go with it is true that what are the root causes? I think we're going to try and touch on this, the root causes of narcissism, or how can it come about? And most narcissists are the children of narcissists. But that's because they've been so destroyed in their real personality. They've had to generate a hologram personality for themselves,
Mm.
But what was your question again? Oh no, yeah. So a child can very quickly realize authenticity, and congruence in people and whether something's genuine. But I know of a family, for example, where the kids would be marched out if there was visitors. Oh, play that tune on the piano for the visitor. And the child is going, every time I played the piano, you slam the door, you tell me to keep it quiet, you tell me to go on outside, you tell me you're trying to listen to the radio, you're watching the television. You never even say, I like that tune, or you're getting good at that. Right? And now suddenly there's a visitor in, and perform for the visitor. And apparently, to the visitors, and you'd hear people, and you were talking about how, you might not know and you might be confused, and you could be confused because there's some conflicts going on in your perceptions, and you might be at the funeral then, later in life, and you overhear somebody saying, oh, your father stroke mother was so proud of all you kids. My God, they really thought so highly. But this, what you would figure out if you ask more questions, is where they're basically bragging about their kids. But the kids then are just an extension of them. They're a trophy. They're a good reflection on them. When it would suit, and I've heard cases like this too, you'd meet somebody that knew the parent and subsequently go, oh, I didn't even know they had kids. Because if it didn't suit, they wouldn't even mention the fact they had kids.
Right.
So, it goes back to one of the basics of narcissism, and with the covert, and these are some of the giveaways, that we'll answer this very structurally before we finish. Some of the giveaways of a covert narcissist, because they are camouflaged, and one is there's no actual true empathy or love there. They're not capable of it.
Mm.
And kids particularly are going to pick up on that. They're going to be able to tell the difference between a put on show of affection and legitimate affection, So will we have a run through the basic characteristics, if you like, of all narcissists?
Yeah, please.
And then we have a framework we're working from. Yeah. If we look at some of the observable signs, and what I mean by observable doesn't mean these are obvious, but if you focus, it's like that saying again, isn't it? If you watch out for yellow cars, you're going to see lots of them.
Yeah.
So, if you're not watching out for this, you're not going to see it. Could be right under your nose, you wouldn't see it. But in general, narcissists seem to be obsessed with themselves and have very little empathy for others. They can put it on, but you'll notice it's very brief. It's not heartfelt. But they'll talk about themselves a lot. They'll focus on themselves. Even people that, and again, a covert narcissist would often do this. They'll, in public, talk about all the things they do and their views and their thoughts. But people close to them would look at it and go, I haven't seen them actually acting out on any of that. They might have strong social views on poverty and that, but yet they've never joined a charitable organization or don't even donate to one. They wouldn't volunteer. There's no actions to back up the words. They exaggerate and fabricate achievements, and they're obsessed with appearance. So even a covert narcissist, you will see that they're very keen to present themselves in a positive way. Now we're all like that, but this would be, this never slips. and it's important to them, you know.
When you
And
say appearance, is that just behavior, or are we talking attire, or both?
well, appearances, so that can be behavior, attire, but also, you know, being seen publicly to be of a higher level, whether it's in terms of possession or where they live or how they keep their house. You know, you don't have to be rich to be a narcissist, you know.
Mm.
But to keep up appearances like that show used to say. Um, and it's again, you'll see that it's, I suppose, a way to watch out and observe for this is to see that they will overreact to any kind of mistake in that area, any slipping of the mask, if you like, you know. So it's
Of the persona that.
yeah, and so strongly. Then they're very black and white thinking about everything and everyone. They'll have an instant like or dislike about somebody, and there'll be no middle ground. They'll have instant likes and dislikes about things, you know, portions of society, activities, you know, an element of snobbery, I suppose. You know,
So
even though
I was going to say, where does the black and white thinking come from? It, in its
again,
origin.
yeah, again, in my view, keeping it simple is as children, you know, we have this sense of need and safety, security, control.
Hmm.
And, you know from doing beliefs work with people, beliefs aren't necessarily facts or truths. They're what we choose to believe as facts that can be our pillars on which to build our lives. Now, if we have things and we get a belief and a fact, if we've any sense of insecurity, we're going to tie ourselves to that pillar. So
So it's
if
that need to believe.
yeah, so their need then is to be very black and white in their beliefs. I can't have a gray area. This is the way it is. So it's very like what they call OCD. You know, OCD is based on control and feeling insecure and a lack of control. And so somebody could just feel if I can keep all my bean tins in the right order, at least that's a start. I've control over the bean tins. So everything's not way out of control. So the black and white thing is, if you think you're trying to keep the plates in so many plates in the air,
Hmm.
if you can set one in stone, you go, well, look, that's that, and I can forget about that. I can focus on all the other plates I have to keep spinning, you know?
Yeah,
If you go into any kind of debate, it's going to undermine your belief. Does that make sense?
yeah, no, it's something I wrote about in my book in terms of the Flat Earth Society. I believe that if you got a certain number of the key influencers in the Flat Earth Society and funded a multi-million-pound trip to space so they could see the Earth from space far enough out of the atmosphere, how many would change their beliefs? And I would hazard a guess that very few or none at all. In other words, their thinking would be, "Oh, it's special effects, it's trickery. I'm not actually there." And it's an example of, as you say, that need to believe. So, that black and white thinking. So if you have benefit to gain from maintaining that black and white binary thinking, you won't give up. You would never give it up. You'll do whatever you can to hold on to that, regardless of any contrary information. And I guess at present in the media, all that's gone on with the, if you're the woke movement, that's a big part of that binary thinking, isn't it? That I'm right, you're wrong. There's no grey area.
Yeah.
Um,
So that's, for example, that would be a good example right now. I might get cancelled for this, but a lot of the people, a lot of the people that promote the woke or that would be behind the woke are minorities. Right? That's just a fact. They'd be a minority, and because of that, they're going to feel vulnerable because they're the smaller group, they're the smaller number, they're being overwhelmed by the others, and there's possibly inequities going on there and discrimination, but that is going to make you feel insecure, unsafe. And so if you feel like that, you're tending towards these more extreme compensations. So one would be to have black and white thinking, look, this is right, and that's all there is to it. Because if I'm sure of this, now I've got a stake in the ground I can hold on to and build from there. Now, if you start to debate any of that, now you're undermining the foundation. of the security. Does that make sense? So
Mm.
you can't, any debate would take away, even if it's not true, the one thing they're absolutely sure about. So going back to the flat earthers, if that's something they feel it's important to them to have that security, you start from that, literally that ground zero, right? Listen, the Earth's flat. I can build on that.
Mm.
They're not going to even entertain the idea. I doubt they'd even go up in the spacecraft, because it would be the beginning of starting to pull on a thread that might unravel everything. And that's the way I think of sort of a lot of obsessive behavior and obsessive thinking and very deeply rooted thinking and black and white thinking, is this feeling that if you pull on that thread, everything is going to unravel.
Which, of course, is one of the reasons, we seldom see narcissists come into therapy. In our practice here in Hampshire, I think when we have a practice meeting, all the therapists, and it's a question I've asked, I think we've only seen maybe 4 in 20 years. And they've usually come because a partner's needed them to come. And actually, I've advised them, if they do have a client who they believe is usually an overt narcissist, don't treat them, because one of the reasons being that you are weaponizing them. Because if you have no empathy and have no concept of empathy, if you're weaponizing somebody to understand what empathy is and what it can gain you, you're just then essentially weaponizing a narcissist, which is certainly something you don't want. But again, part of therapy is shifting belief systems, isn't it? I mean, most of the work really at some level is challenging beliefs and shifting those beliefs. And if you have binary black and white thinking and need to maintain those beliefs, as a narcissist does, you'll never change him. In fact, if anything, you'll build more brick walls and machine gun nests to protect those beliefs.
Well, funny, I have a story there where I think is a good example is of a narcissist that I knew, and I had this book on beliefs work, and they were unhappy. A covert narcissist, you could see behind the scenes they were unhappy, and they were damaged and suffering. So I was talking to them about beliefs work in one of their vulnerable moments, and they expressed an interest. And I said, well, look, I have a couple of books. I'll leave one in to you if you want to have a look. And oh, yeah, why not? So I dropped in this book and said nothing more, but no pressure. And I met them again in their own home, maybe 6 weeks later. And then I see the book on the table. So firstly, the book was out, and I saw a bookmark about halfway through it. And I said, have you been having a flick through the book? Oh, I was reading it there. Yes, yeah. And what do you think? Very interesting. And I said, really? So I was astonished that they took an interest in this. I said, really? Yeah. Isn't it hard to believe there's people out there like that? So that's the depth of the self-delusion, if you like, of a narcissist. They cannot, it's not their fault, which makes it one of the hard ways to deal with them, the way you have to deal with them. And they could be suffering more than the people around them. But they cannot let themselves be aware that there's a possibility they might have a problem.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
That's what I mean. So if we go back, I'll quickly whiz through some of the main traits. Knowing that, you'll see where these come about. They never take responsibility for their actions. If something goes wrong or isn't right, it's someone else's fault, and probably yours if you're involved with them. If they perform any kind of favor, they expect what's showered with praise and be repaid many times over. They'll hide and deny any malicious intentions they've had. If they get nearly caught, and they'll absolutely blatantly barefaced lie about it. They'll work to disrupt, destroy, belittle any friendships or closeness you might have. They try and undermine you because it's very important that they're above you. So if you begin to be getting any way developed or growing, they're going to try and stamp that down, because it has to be, in order to be a host, you have to be little or lower than them. They're very dependent, can't be left alone. They have to get attention and praise all the time, and especially from whoever their main source might be. Now, usually we're talking there about a partner, but it could be a child, They'll they'll act bizarrely if they're experiencing or sensing a loss of control, and will do anything to get it back. So this is when you can kind of see them losing the plot. But again, it's highlighting their need to keep control, which is based in insecurity, you know. They can show signs of paranoia, you know, and again, the covert narcissist, particularly in this case, you know, the world is out to get them. Everybody's let them down, you know, nobody is good for them.
What's the origin of the paranoia? I know often when we talk about paranoia, we talk about the anal paranoidal type, that obsessional personality type. But in terms of narcissism, what is the necessity for paranoia? Is that going back to a need to maintain their beliefs, and so anything that might undermine that might, I mean, they wouldn't change their beliefs, but it would be uncomfortable. So what's the evolutionary benefit of, if you will, of having paranoia for a narcissist?
Yeah, again, if we keep it simple, if they have, so they've created, so some level of them knows that what they're projecting isn't their true selves. So it's a little bit of this imposter syndrome you hear from a lot of clients, a lot of people with anxiety, a lot of people with low self-esteem, with issues of that regard, have this sort of imposter complex where they feel, in fact, I find it's the root of most anxiety. People are going about and they have this feeling there's something about them that if people knew, well, then they'd be found out and they'd be isolated, they'd be rejected, they'd be basically dead.
Which again, in evolutionary terms, so I'll go back to that in a second, but
yeah. So again, I often say to clients, you know, because nowadays, again, on social media, you have a lot of people going, you shouldn't care what people think. And it's almost as if it's a weakness. But as you said, that's evolutionary. You know, rejection is a life or death situation only about that long ago in evolution.
Yeah, if we were in tribes of 150 and if we were rejected and extradited from that group, that would mean almost certain death. So that's almost the evolutionary origin of social anxiety, isn't it?
Yeah,
so similarly, if you're found out and rejected from the group, it'll be even more importance for a covert narcissist, I imagine. So that must create tremendous anxiety, hence the paranoia.
Yeah. And hence, you know, so because paranoia be common to a lot of people, a level of it, you know, then it's a mistrust or they're all out to get me. But exactly as you said, you know, just a blip ago in evolution, if we were rejected by our tribe, we weren't let into the cave or up the tree or into the village, we were dead. We're like that zebra that David Attenborough sees has got separated from the herd. And we know what's going to happen to him, you know. So yeah, it's like a deeper rooted version of that.
And if you're watching this and I'm sure that we think we have evolved, then next time you're out for a walk or sat somewhere and you see a face in something, and it may be a cup of coffee or a face in a tree, or you look at the clouds, you see a face, that's called pareidolia. That's a leftover from your hunter-gatherer days, because a face was a threat. So we're still hardwired to see faces in things, because that face could mean almost certain death. So as you say, Kieran, we haven't evolved that much.
No, I mean, and it's funny, like if you tell someone you do hypnotherapy, they're immediately guarded and they go, what would you do? And I'm saying, I'm telling you up front, I'm a hypnotherapist. I'm announcing myself as hypnotherapist. I said, you're being hypnotized and influenced left, right, and center by people who aren't telling you what they're doing. So all advertising, the news, most media is rooted in this evolutionary thing. That's why the news is all bad news, because we're wired to be, our attention to be grabbed by bad news. As you're saying, you know, if we were walking through the forest back in the day and we heard a rustle in the trees and we assumed it was just the wind, we're more likely to be attacked by a wild animal. If we assume it's a wild animal every time, even though 9 times out of 10 it's not, we have a better chance of surviving. And so that's what's become wired into us. And that's why now we need to hear every bit of bad news, because we at some level need to be prepared for what might be coming. And you were talking before we came on air as such about research around social media and happiness. And that's why we become more unhappy, because you can never relax. I meet people now and they have a thing on their wrist and it bings and go, what's that? Did you get a message? Is that a call from home? oh no, somebody's been knocked down on the A26. Why do we need to know that? But it's this, so you can never relax. That's a threat. There's a threat coming through on your phone.
Yeah,
We were talking earlier about discontent and comparisons and comparing yourself with others now that we can see. And that's a threat. Well, if I'm not as good as them, am I acceptable? Is my friend circle going to accept me or reject me? Am I not trendy enough? Am I not up to speed enough? It's a constant stress. So that's applies to absolutely everyone. So with narcissists, I again think that most, disorders, as we call them these days, are just exaggerations of normal feelings and normal behaviors. We can all feel a bit paranoid. We can all feel a bit insecure. We can all feel a bit threatened. But it's when that becomes chronic and then it becomes a part of us that we don't even realize, then it's a problem. I suppose I'm probably misquoting Carl Jung, but he said something along the lines of that until the subconscious is made conscious, we'll be the victim of it and we'll call it fate. So if we don't know we've a problem, we just see the results of it in our lives and we just put it down. So a covert narcissist is a great example of this. Life's dealt them a bad hand. It's been unfair. They've had it rough and it's nothing to do with them, which is why, unfortunately, they never come to therapy. And unfortunately
yeah,
for them, in most cases, they'll never be kind of cured,
yeah.
So the difference then between those obvious ones we were talking about there, one of the last things, I think we talked about this in the last podcast, there's the 4 C's that are often identifiable or attributed to the narcissist, where they've charm, charisma, confidence, and cleverness. Sometimes they're missing from a covert narcissist, which makes
Yeah.
them harder to spot. But it becomes one of the biggest differences. They're not always that charming. They don't tend to have that charisma. And often they might feel quite socially anxious and awkward and uncomfortable socially, which you
How
would throw you
how
off the
does that
scent completely.
how does that manifest? And is that um, uncomfortable behavior manufactured or real?
It's real, yeah, because I suppose, and this, I suppose, different types evolve depending on the personality itself, and God knows a million different things. But it's quite a strain to maintain. You need a lot of energy to maintain a public persona. And maybe covert narcissists don't have the energy to do that. Maybe they have had a rough life. Maybe they don't have that root personality that has that drive and that energy. So they pull back a little bit.
So how do they manipulate without being obvious to it? Now, if you've got experience of covert narcissism, you can see it like so clearly. But if you haven't, you wouldn't expect to look for it. So how can a covert narcissist manipulate others without just being obvious about it?
All right, yeah. So they work more the victim side of things. This is why, again, the diagnosis of them has been come along later in the day than other types, because previously they were being diagnosed as depressives or anxious people. So socially anxious, etc., etc. But that's because they were some of the characteristics that were being witnessed by those close to them. But they use those then to manipulate. So we know already narcissists attract, empathic people, fixers, helpers, and funnily enough, the overly optimistic and overly positive,
Yeah,
because they think, oh no, I can help this, I can make them happy, I can, and we know like that's an impossibility. So the covert narcissist uses this manipulation based on their victimhood, and they attract the similar kind of people. And this time it's more through those people looking to rescue them, or they've pity for them, or they want to help them because they've been such a victim. And then they use guilt to manipulate a lot.
Kieran, can you explain how covert narcissists manipulate others without being obvious about it?
Yeah, so this is kind of where they've gotten their name. Covert and camouflaged is they do manipulate and they do most of the things all other narcissists do, but not in the overbearing, grandiose, overconfident, almost aggressive way that a lot of the others will do. So what they do is they use that victimhood as a way to lure in their usual hosts, as we talked about. So again, these are going to be people who want to rescue somebody or who pity somebody, they're empathic, or they've this tendency to help people, and in this case, someone they see as a victim. But they use this victimhood to manipulate this kind of help. It can be even financial help at the end of the day. They use guilt, and they continue the guilt in that no matter how much help you give them, it's not enough, or you've let them down. So they're guilting you into this. And even with that help, they'll find some other way where the world outside of your help has let them down, and they drag you in even further. So empaths in particular are drawn in by this story. But what you can sometimes notice is this clash or this disharmony between this story they're telling you and then their anger and their abusive reactions to your efforts to try and help them. Their negative moods can start becoming exhausting, you know. But now they've guilted somebody so much that, you know, they'd feel too guilty to leave these people, to move away from them, you know. And you keep throwing yourself into it more and more and more with these feelings of hope and guilt and fear, hoping that you'll change them, guilt if you leave, and fear then, because if they're narcissists, they'll have isolated you. We talked about how they'll break down your friendships, your hobbies, your social life, and they'll have you. So you've got this fear now of, God, if I did leave them, where would I go? Who would I have?
Yeah.
You know? So,
and I know we often talk about red flags, but often more red flags than a Chinese parade. But often we don't see the red flags until afterwards, retrospectively, do we?
yeah, or somebody has to point it out, you know,
Or
because
somebody
like
points
I
it out.
said, especially if you grow up in this, you know, I know somebody else who, you know, later in life, they were in a relationship and they were unhappy in this relationship and it wasn't going well, but they were crazy about the person. And only when they spoke to a relationship counselor after the relationship had broken up and they'd gone because they were heartbroken, the counselor said, well, does that not look familiar to you? Do you not see a familiarity there? And they're going, no, what? And they outlined the way they're treating them. Well, she's always been very cold towards you. She's only been nice to you if it's working in her direction. Um, you can't rely on her. She's very frugal, we'll say, with compliments or affection or anything like that. So that's a carbon copy of your mother. And it was only then it struck them there, oh my God, you know? And that was after they were out of it. But see, that's this the other problem we don't even have time to go into here in later life, that you know, your relationships, you use usually carbon copies of your earliest relationships and often with your parents. And
Yeah.
you tend to go on and act out and seek out similar people for future relationships and you continue to suffer, you know?
I know we've kind of touched on that before in our kind of little chats in between. I think there's a whole podcast there about why we're drawn unconsciously to the worst sides of our experiences.
Yeah.
I know we're running out of time. Are there any practical strategies that individuals can use to cope with or protect themselves from covert narcissistic behavior? Because I do know that if you're in the thick of it, you can feel quite isolated. And my hope is if you're watching this or you know somebody who's experiencing covert narcissism, then actually, you know, you're in a world of trouble. You're in a world of pain. So is there anything protection wise? I know we talk about grey walling, stone walling. What can somebody do? Who's perhaps in a relationship and there's no children involved, and one, if there is children involved, what can they do?
Okay, yeah. So there's good and bad news here. Good is that the advice is very simple and very simple. You can really pause this and write down the following steps. The bad news is it's quite extreme. But unfortunately, the reason it's extreme is you have to take it as a baseline that you can't cure the narcissist. They're not going to change. And simple as that. So we just
Yeah,
keep it that simple.
yeah,
So the ideal, so I know you're talking about someone if there's kids involved or not. We can see how you need to modify this if circumstances dictate otherwise. But the ideal is no contact. Break all contact with them. That's the ideal. So your only way out, just completely just break contact.
Yeah.
It works really well with them. You can expect, as they call them, flying monkeys, smear campaigns, and testing of your boundaries. They will do everything and anything to try and draw you back in, and what they call, again, such a large area, narcissistic baiting. They will know your raw nerves, they'll know your sensitivities, and they'll try and use them to lure you out, if you like. They'll bait you, they'll try and antagonize you to get a reaction. So you really watch for that. You really have to dig your heels in to maintain this and not react, not respond. If it's not possible to have no contact, then minimize the engagement. Absolute bare minimal, absolutely necessary contact, and nothing more, nothing less. With any unavoidable engagement, form and strengthen your internal boundaries, and be sure to work on not personalizing the experience. So this is a really important thing I'll get down to in a minute, or we go to it now. Don't personalize. So this is
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so that's it. Realize it's not about you. And even when they say that it is, it's not about you. And don't try and change to suit them. So that's what don't personalize means, just really keep it. I mean, it's very simple. It's quite radical, but this is the expert's advice. And when you look at it and you learn more about it, you see it's pretty much the only way. But don't personalize as a way of helping you to do this. It's not about you, even when they say that it is, because that'll ring a bell with somebody who's been involved with a narcissist, because they're going to have a history of being told everything is their fault and you made them do this and you created this situation and you caused that. The grey rock you've been talking about is the classic. Don't react, don't respond. Remember, you're fuel, you're feed for them, and you're a feed for their ego and their beliefs. And as soon as you stop providing that, then it's like any predator. So we talked about them being a parasite and a host. If you think of them as a predator, if you play dead, the predator loses interest after a while. Now, how long it takes them to lose interest is a piece of string. But if you maintain grey rock, if you don't respond, you don't react, you don't make contact, they will lose interest, because they need, more than they need you, they need supply, and they'll move on. And they will move on. I heard somebody talking about them being more like sprinters than marathon runners. They're instant gratification. They need it now. Which is why you see that lack of empathy when they break up with somebody. It'll be the other person's problem, their fault. I know cases where they've tried to have the partner committed, sectioned. So that's great. But the following day, they're on the websites, they're on the dating apps, or they're out socializing, and they're up with somebody else as quick as humanly possible. So the grey rock is just, imagine a grey rock and how inert it is and how unreactive it is. You pour water on it, it runs off it. You hit it with a stick, nothing happens. You poke it, you push it, nothing happens. And it's the way out.
I love the play dead analogy. As you say, stonewalling, grey-walling. I think we need to wrap it up there. But I think what I want to say is, if you are watching this, if you have experienced a relationship with a narcissist, particularly a covert narcissist, do seek out help, because you will be wounded, you will have trauma as a result of that. Wouldn't you agree, Kieran?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because you've missed the fundamentals, the basics. You won't have had a secure situation. You won't have had unconditional loving. You won't have been with somebody who actually does care about you. You've been drawn into something that was none of the things you thought. And even an adult, that can be traumatic to realize that.
Yeah. It's I've heard it described as having an injury. The injury may have healed, but the scars are still there. So do reach out. I'll include below a link to Kieran's website, to our website, and there's quite a number of blogs on our website to do with narcissism. Have a read of those. And if any of us out there can help you, do seek out help, because actually, you probably don't realize right now how much trauma you've experienced as a result of being in a relationship, if you've been married to a covert narcissist. And I implore you just to get some help. Kieran, is there anything you'd like to say to wrap up what's hopefully been really interesting podcast today?
Hopefully, yeah. I'll just tick off the last few, because for people who, mightn't have any resources or ability to get help, or maybe just need to do something right now, the last few things to tick off is accept that they are what they are. It's not going to change, and you have a choice whether to stay or engage.
Yeah.
Don't engage with them. Have this realistic knowledge that it's not going to change. It's not going to get better no matter what actions you take. Don't get in the mud with them. Don't engage in arguments or discussions, and never call them out as being narcissists. You're really lighting a powder keg there. Don't explain. Don't apologize. They're not listening. They'll still blame you. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what they do. Don't excuse their behavior. Don't go off and say, oh, well, I did this or I did that. The more you step away, the more you'll see that it is actually them. And if you were born to a narcissist, as a child, you had no choices. But now, as you say, you have choices, you have knowledge, and you have access to help.
Mm. There is an app, a website that's not well known. I think it's called Just Amy, Ask Amy. So I'm going to include a link below. And if you are in a relationship or were married to a narcissist, you can actually put the text, if they're sending you texts to do with your offsprings, you can put it in this website, and it will actually analyze it for manipulative behavior. Wow. It's actually really interesting. I'll include a link below. So the algorithm can obviously determine by the use of the language how you're being manipulated, and etc. So, Kieran, any last words?
No. Time went too quickly again. So you can see that we just barely skated over the surface of every topic we've touched on today.
Yeah.
It's a huge area. And again, for people who have encountered these, one thing we didn't say is not everyone who has a chest pain is having a heart attack. Not everyone exhibits some of these behaviors as a narcissist. So that's something I think we need to be a bit careful about. It's very much a trendy buzzword at the moment. And
yeah.
But if you see a collection of these traits, and even there's so much information online now, you can look up and see what's technically defining narcissists now, make it a bit easier for you.
And again, I'll include a link to the first podcast that I did with Kieran below. I think next time, I think we should deep dive into our own experiences, and maybe if there's somebody else out there who'd like to reach out, maybe we could share those experiences. So for today, because we're out of time, Kieran, thank you so much again. I know people will get a lot of value from what you've spoken about today and what we've discussed. So huge thanks. And
thank you.
I'll see you next time.
Always a pleasure.